And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the laps of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
Well, thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is Connecting Nepal to the World, with the aim to bring the leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goals. This is the 6th session of the conference, and to moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Pramod Jaiswal here with us. Dr. Pramod Jaiswal is a research director at Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. He is a visiting fellow at Sandia National Laboratories, New Mexico, United States, and Senior Fellow at Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, New Delhi. Dr. Jaiswal has been a regular and visiting faculty at different universities of Nepal and China. Without any further ado, I request Dr. Jaiswal to take over.
Professor Barry Buzan and distinguished participants, welcome to the 6th session of NICE Global Conclave. We are having a special lecture on the structure of global international system in the coming decade with Professor Barry Buzan, who is a Professor Emeritus, Department of International Relations, London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Buzan, we are really honored to have you at NICE. We are really grateful for providing us your valuable time. So we are really excited today. We have received around 2,500 registrations for this event. So you can understand that how much the people are excited of this event. Professor Buzan need no introduction. However, let me briefly introduce Professor Buzan. Professor Barry Buzan is Emeritus Professor, London School of Economics and Political Science. He is formerly Montague Burton Professor, Honorary Professor of Copenhagen, Jilin, and China's Foreign Affairs University, a Senior Fellow at LSE Ideas, and a Fellow of the British Academy. He was Project Director at the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, Research Professor of International Studies at the University of Westminster, and Professor of International Studies at the University of Warwick. He was also Visiting Professor at the International University of Japan and Olof Palme Visiting Professor in Sweden. He took his first degree at the University of British Columbia and his doctorate degree at the London School of Economics. He has written, authored, and edited over 25 books, written or co-authored nearly 150 articles, chapters, and lectured, broadcasted, or presented papers in nearly 25 countries. The program is streaming live on Facebook, and we'd like to request all our participants to share the video link on their social media so that maximum can benefit from this discussion. Please drop your question in the Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. Professor Barry Buzan, we'd like to request you to make your presentation in 20-25 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. So over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Pramod, for that kind introduction. As you say, my topic today is the structure of global international society in the coming decade. And I'm going to focus in particular on an idea that I'm calling deep pluralism. Pardon my sun hat. I'm sitting in my conservatory and it happens to be a sunny day in London, somewhat unexpectedly. Now, deep pluralism is something I've written quite a bit about over the last few years. So I'm sticking my neck out here, making a kind of prediction about how I see things going. So what I'm going to do is briefly introduce the idea of deep pluralism as the structure of global international society that we're heading into, and will probably be in for some time. And then I'm going to suggest 5 basic characteristics that are likely to mark this structure. And on the basis of that, we can then proceed to a Q&A. Well, the basic idea of deep pluralism is quite simple. It's the notion that wealth and power, but also, and importantly, cultural and political authority are becoming more and more diffuse in international society. We have lived for a long time now in an international society where wealth and power were quite concentrated, and so were cultural and political authority. And I think we're moving away from that. You can see this movement in 2 different ways. One is that the process of modernity is spreading ever more widely around the planet. More and more peoples and societies and states are coming to terms with modernity in their own way. This has been going on for a long time, but rather slowly. So those of you who know the history of Japan can see how that happened in Japan in the 19th century. Those of you who've been following China and some of the Northeast Asian countries can see how that's been happening since the later decades of the 20th century. So modernity is, and the wealth and power and cultural and political authority that go with it are becoming ever more diffused throughout international society. This is still uneven, but it's a lot less uneven than it was before, and the trend is continuing in that direction. Another way of seeing this, which is related, is that this is in a sense, the ending period of the era of Western domination, which has been going on for the last couple of centuries in the world. It might be a bit of a push to say we're entering into the post-Western era, because I don't want to imply that the West is down and out and about to disappear. What I'm saying is, in the notion of deep pluralism, is that the West will become one of several centers of wealth and power and cultural and political authority. And you can see that process going on all around, most obviously with the rise of China, but also in other more subtle ways. This means, in a sense, that if you understand international society as having been a core periphery system for the last couple of centuries, then the core is expanding and the periphery is, in a sense, shrinking. And perhaps a good symbol of that is the G7, which initially embodied the idea of a Western-dominated core, but now, as it were, has shifted more towards outfits like the G20. So you see that the group of countries and societies and economies that constitute the core of global society are widening. So that's the basic idea, that we're moving away from, in a sense, the first round of modernity, which was dominated by the early modernizers, all of whom were well embarked on a modernization process by the late 19th century. Then there was a long gap in which not many other societies succeeded in acquiring modernity. And now we're moving into a period where other societies are quite rapidly beginning to do this. So what we're looking at then is a future in which there will be a much more diffuse pattern of wealth and power and cultural and political authority in the system. The big question attached to that is whether this will result in a kind of contested global order. Those of you familiar with the old realist theories of multipolarity might want to understand it in that way, that a multipolar order is going to be more disorderly, more contested, that these new and old centers of wealth and power and cultural and political authority will not get on with each other, not respecting each other. Or it could be more consensual, where there is, in a sense, an acceptance and respect for difference. Here, the analogy might be biodiversity. Monoculture is generally thought to be weak and vulnerable in biological terms. So a biologically diverse ecology is generally thought to be more stable and more desirable. Whether that can work in the context, the social and political context of global society is the big question before us. And in a sense, that is where the scope for agency lies in all of this. We have the choice whether we want to make this deep pluralism either more consensual or more contested. I think we are going to get deep pluralism whether we like it or not, and that's so that's the kind of foundation of my talk here. All right, so with that in hand, let me then proceed to look briefly at 5 likely characteristics of this deep pluralist order. Now, the first one, I'm going to stick my neck out a bit because it's not a common view, but I'm going to argue that in this deep pluralist order, there will be no superpowers. Right? There will be quite a few great powers and lots of regional powers, but there won't be any superpowers. And the logic here is fairly straightforward. I mean, if you like, you can simply see that, you know, once upon a time, back after the Second World War, briefly, we had 3 superpowers, Britain, at the end of the Second World War, Britain and the US and the Soviet Union. And then we had 2 when Britain faded away. Then we had 1 after the end of the Cold War. And I think the next position on this sequence is 0. And the argument here is that superpowers are a strange product of the period of Western domination, when a ridiculously small group of countries dominated the entirety of international society in a very big and quite effective way. And that period required that only a small number of countries be in command of the wealth and power of modernity. And as modernity spreads ever more widely and more states and peoples acquire that wealth and power, it's going to be more and more difficult for any single country or even a group of countries to acquire the sorts of resources that are necessary to be a superpower. If you think about it, when Britain was a superpower back in the middle of the 19th century, it was commanding, getting on for half of world manufacturing and trade. And something similar was true of the United States when it found itself at the end of the Second World War in a period of great economic and political and military superiority. But how is anybody now, even China, how is anybody going to acquire nearly half of world production and the world's wealth and power? Because everybody's getting more wealth and power, and therefore the scope for the kinds of concentrations of wealth and power needed to support a superpower position is, I think, disappearing. I also think as part of this, that the notion of anti-hegemony is getting stronger. Much of the Western period has revolved around hegemonic leaders and hegemonic powers and such like. But as the rest of the world regains its strength, as it were, and acquires the benefits and powers of modernity, that's going to going to disappear. And it seems to me that the global society that is emerging will not have any particular desire for hegemonic leadership. Indeed, it will probably be very antagonistic to hegemonic leadership. It's had enough of that. And this is, in a sense, what is meant by deep pluralism, that the world is moving towards a distribution of power, which is also accompanied by cultural and political diversity. And I don't think there's anything we can do about this. That's just happening. The question is how we handle it. But because it's happening like that, this, I think, means that we will have a world without superpowers. And this will therefore be quite a different world from the one we've been living in for quite some time. And I don't think superpowers are coming back anytime soon. So we need to live or learn to live in a world with a more diffuse distribution of wealth and power and cultural and political authority. So, okay, first point. Now, the second point, this, as I've suggested, this world is going to contain no superpowers, but a number of great powers. They won't all be the same weight, just as they weren't in the 20th century, when countries, if you look around the time of the First World War, there were maybe up to 9 great powers, some of which were much stronger than others, but all of which were counted as great powers. Now, the difficulty, I think, here is that these, the likely great powers in this period going forward are going to be rather introverted. And this, of course, raises a difficulty about how this deep pluralist global society is going to be managed. There are 2 reasons why the likely set of great powers are going to be introverted. The first one is that the old great powers, mainly the Western powers plus Japan, are a bit exhausted and fed up with this job. Right? They have not had many thank yous for what they've done. They have wasted a lot of lives and treasure. Think of American ventures in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. The American electorate, as indicated by the election of Trump a while back, is really no longer very keen on running the world, being the world's policeman, and paying the price for doing all that. The EU doesn't really have the political capacity, and neither does it have the political will to take on that role, and neither does Japan. Right? All of them are under a kind of post-colonial cloud, and therefore the legitimacy of their leadership is declining. And whilst the Americans had quite a lot of legitimacy for a while, I think that it has now declined as well, with a lot of help from Donald Trump, who set about dismantling much of the institutional and social structure of American power during his period in office. So it seems to me we've got a set of old great powers that are tired and worn out and whose electorates no longer support the idea of spending a lot of money on being global leaders. If we look at the rising great powers, we get a different picture, but with the same outcome, i.e. rather introverted. Just take China and India as examples. The interesting thing about China and India is that whilst they wish to be acknowledged as great powers, they also wish to hang on to their status as developing countries. It somewhat surprises me that China, at least, has not become embarrassed by this, but the Chinese government is very keen to hang on to this standing. Basically, that creates an unusual, even unprecedented kind of great power. Great powers in the past have all been those at the leading edge of development. So to have developing countries as great powers produces an odd combination. These countries, they want the rights and the respect and the status due to being great powers, understandably, because they are big powers, but they don't want any of the responsibilities that go with it, because they say, we're developing countries, and they say this with quite good reason. I'm not being critical here. I'm just pointing out the fact. they say we're developing countries and our principal obligation is to develop ourselves, and that's our contribution, and we don't want to get bogged down or entangled in running the rest of the world. So this means, and I think this would be true of other potential developing country great powers like Brazil, for example, that they would take a similar line, which means when you add it all up, that all of the great powers, both the old ones and the new ones, are introverted and not really very interested in taking on the responsibilities of running the world. Right? This means we have an undermanagement problem for global international society in this emerging deep pluralist system. Okay, that's the second characteristic. The third one is that this deep pluralist international society will, I think, be infused, particularly from the global south, but there's a sense in which this is a global issue as well, will be infused with a lot of post-colonial resentment. That resentment has been around for a long time, and quite a lot of societies in the global south, and also China, cultivate this. Those of you who know anything about China will know that you don't have to be there long before you hear about the century of humiliation and how awful it was, and that line is repeated over and over again, and it affects Chinese policy on a day-to-day basis. So the humiliations and debasements and disrespectfulness of colonialism is still very much alive and well in the memories of the global south, but it's much less strongly placed in the former colonial powers themselves, who, although they are increasingly acknowledged that not everything they did was wonderful, have tended as societies to forget about this and to push it into the past. So there's been extensive forgetting and marginalization of the misdeeds and cruelties and inequalities and humiliations of the colonial period. Now it seems to me that post-colonial resentment is being repowered by the fact that many of the societies that experienced it are becoming wealthy and powerful in their own right, and they haven't forgotten. Right? So this resentment is now well-funded and well-backed by wealth and power and cultural and political authority. And it shows no sign, it seems to me, of going away. And this is a major problem for how deep pluralism is going to be managed. If unaddressed, this issue would push, I think, towards the problem that I mentioned of the system being undermanaged. It would, in a sense, cultivate a contested version of deep pluralism rather than a consensual one. And that seems to me to be one of the dangers that we need to address. And this needs to be addressed from both sides. Those former colonial powers need to step up a bit and acknowledge more of what they did. But the former colonial powers also need to step up a bit, look forward more than past, and also take some of their own responsibility for the fact that they got colonized and that in many cases there was extensive collaboration with the colonial powers. This is a painful, difficult issue, but if it isn't resolved, it's going to poison relations within global society and make the management of that society much more difficult. The fourth thing I would point out, a fourth kind of characteristic here, is that probably the influence of non-state actors will decline. I'm thinking particularly here of international non-governmental organizations. During the period when globalization was fashionable, it was generally thought that such organizations would play an increasing role in global society. But under deep pluralism, I think there are question marks around that. I think firms probably, and corporations will probably continue to play a fairly big role, as will as it were, the dark side of non-state organizations, the terrorist organizations and criminal organizations. They're not going away anytime soon. But most of the other NGOs have been Western ones, right? And with the decline of, the relative decline of Western power and influence, it seems to me the backing that those organizations have had, which have backed all kinds of things. I mean, human rights, women's rights in particular. Those things are going to be much less strongly backed. Most of those organizations, being Western, were liberal, and the liberal teleology is also in decline here. So this is something to think about, that it may be that many of the things that those organizations have pushed for and represented will be less strongly and widely done in the pluralist world order. We would not expect authoritarian societies like China and Russia, for example, to generate a lot of non-governmental organizations. That's not what they do. It's not in their basic character to do that. So it seems to me one of the possibilities here is that that aspect of global society may well go into some decline along with the relative decline of the West. As I said, the West is not going away. It's not about to disappear, but it is in relative decline. And since it has been the main source of this aspect of global society, I think we have to look at that quite carefully and think about whether that's going to, as it were, decrease or decline as a feature of global society. And the fifth aspect of this, which is dependent on the first in many ways, is that a pluralist, a deeply pluralist global international society is likely to be more regionalized and less globalized than what we have been used to. This is particularly the case if I'm right about there being no superpowers. If I'm wrong, and if the United States and China become, in a sense, a new Cold War, a new superpower dyad, then we will get a similar sort of overlay to the kind that we had in the Cold War, and which Oda Wever and I wrote a great deal about nearly 20 years ago now in that book, Regions and Powers, which some of you may know. But if it is a world of great powers, then it is more likely to be a regionalizing world. Nobody is going to be doing what the United States has done and intervening everywhere and all and sundry. And what we see emerging between China and the United States is not so much a global rivalry, although it has some aspects of that, but it's a rivalry about spheres of influence in Asia. How localized this will remain is, of course, one of the great questions of the day. But it seems to me quite probable, worth keeping in mind as a feature to look for, that more and more the great powers will be concerned with the areas around them, their immediate neighborhoods, rather than being concerned about the planet as a whole. The absence of superpowers and the winding down of the liberal teleology about the world means, in a sense, nobody wants to run the world. Nobody wants to control it. Nobody wants to impose their ideology on it, particularly. Everybody wants to get along doing their own thing on their own patch. So this points, to me at any rate, towards more of a regional ordering. The European Union is a good example of that. It's concerned with itself and its immediate periphery, but not with too much far beyond that. You can see the way that China is particularly concerned with its region, and so is India, and increasingly, I suspect the United States will move in the same direction. Right? So that's the fifth, in a sense, prediction about what the character of this deep pluralist order will be. Okay, I've only got a couple of minutes left. So to wrap up, I think, as I've suggested already, that there's a very strong momentum behind this, which is basically to do with the decline of the West and the spread of modernity. And so I think we're going to get a deep pluralist global order, whether we like it or not. Right? That's basically unstoppable at this point. So the question is, what does it look like politically? What's the way of getting the best out of it? I think there are two interesting kind of counter forces to, in a sense, the disaggregation or the decentering of the world order that this implies. One is that there still remains, and I think will remain, a widespread interest in maintaining a significant global trading system. It's hard to think of any of the major powers who don't want this or don't need it in some respect. So trade, as it has done for a long time, will, I think, remain a significant aspect of globalization, although not the all-pervasive, all-swallowing, all-dominating aspect it seemed to be during the 1990s and the early part of the 21st century. I think the other interesting counterweight to fragmentation, and I'll end on this notice, is the idea that increasingly as a species, as humankind, if you want to put it on that level, we are facing a number of rather severe shared fate problems. And I will mention only climate change. You can think of a variety of others for yourself. But in relation to climate change, as in relation to some other things as well, we are all in the same boat. Right? That boat would seem to be sinking. So unless we can pull together in some way on issues of this kind, we're going to be collectively in very deep trouble. It's very difficult to predict exactly when a suitable sense of crisis will kick in about something like climate change. Could be quite soon, could be a decade or two or three down the line, but that it's coming seems to me, at any rate, unarguable, and that therefore it will have to be confronted. And whether we confront it by fighting amongst ourselves for the deteriorating and shrinking habitable areas of the planet, or cooperating with amongst ourselves to address issues like climate change and try to do it collectively, since it is a planetary scale issue, that remains the big question. I hope we take the latter course, and I don't think there's anything in the structure of deep pluralism that stands in the way of that. Even if you think back to the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to cooperate on some things which were seen as matters of survival. So they cooperated, for example, on arms control. Something like climate change stands outside of culture and ideological differences. And therefore, at least in principle, it should be easier to cooperate on that. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Buzan. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation. We really learned a lot. I'm sure our audience also benefited immensely from it. We have received lots of questions, so I'll try to club 3 questions and then share with you. Let me share the first set of questions. With the rising trend of securitization of vaccines and health infrastructure, especially during the pandemic and subsequent emergence of interstate conflict over health diplomacy, how would that impact the overall international order in the coming decade? There are other 2 questions on COVID and similar lines. In the current context, as the world still battles with the coronavirus, are we heading towards profound pluralism? And third is, I would like to know your views on pandemic as non-traditional threat, and how do you see water security from the prism of national non-traditional security issues?
Okay. Good questions. My answer is very similar to the one for climate change. I don't think that the deeply pluralist structure that we are now drifting into poses any specific barrier to cooperation on things like global public health. So global public health and pandemics would be a very similar kind of shared fate logic to climate change. It's a global issue. We're all confronted by it. You can't kind of go off by yourself and tackle it, or at least you can't do that very effectively. So it calls for some kind of global response. If we take that as a model of what we're likely to see on other issues, such as climate change, it's neither an extremely good nor an extremely bad picture. It's a bit of a mixed bag. So in some respects, global cooperation in relation to the current pandemic has been pretty impressive. In the sense, especially if you look at the scientific level, there's been a lot of scientific cooperation, a lot of exchange of information, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all to the good. There has been at least some attempt to address the inequities in terms of access to vaccines and such like, although so far quite inadequate. On the other hand, there have been quite a lot of fragmenting responses. China and the United States have just kind of bundled this into their propaganda war against each other, each trying to put the blame on the other for this, and to make them carry the can, as it were, for this global problem. There has been a lot of vaccine nationalism with those countries that are richer, buying up larger stocks of the vaccines to the detriment of those who are less well off. There has been shutting down responses, of course, in relation to global travel and tourism, the attempt for whole countries to self-isolate. It seems to me that we will be learning a lot of lessons from this, the way we responded to this pandemic. And so this sets up the opening round of negotiations, if you will, about how we're going to deal with global problems, shared fate global problems. I wouldn't give the current effort in relation to the pandemic more than, I don't know, a grade C. No, it's not completely hopeless. It's not a total failure, but it's a long way from being a great success or the best that could possibly be done. So a very mixed bag, plenty to learn. Let's hope we do better next time.
Let me move to the next set of questions, sir. The next set of questions is about your book. Like your book published in 2018 titled Global International Society, a new framework for analysis, explains why the differences among states are as important as their similarities in understanding the structure and dynamics of contemporary GIS. Could you briefly elaborate on the point made in your book? Second is, what is the greatest strength and weaknesses, if any, of the English school in looking at 21st century international relations? What are your views on it? And third, is the international society order perpetuated predominantly by the individualist game, or does collectivism still remain?
Oh, how long have we got? Those are rather enormous questions. And I can't really give them a coherent answer in this kind of format. Let me therefore say what it is I'm doing myself now, which might give some sense of where I'm taking my earlier work. I'm in the I hope getting close to the final stages of writing what will be a rather large book. At the moment it's 175,000 words on global society, and I'm using the English school framework, particularly the idea of primary institutions, and I'm combining that also with looking at the material conditions in which global society operates. I'm doing this as a kind of, the book is a halfway house between world or global history on one hand and global historical sociology on the other. It is it is a history of humankind since the end of the last ice age, but it is not told as historians would tell it in terms of who did what to whom, when, and why. It's told in terms of what the social structure looked like at any given point in time, and when, how, and why it changed. And this gives me, I think, a particularly good handle on modernity. At the moment, my argument is that modernity has gone or is going through two phases. That we had an initial phase which runs from the early 19th century up until just about now, which can be defined as a transitional phase between the kind of classical dynastic imperial period that preceded it and the one we're about to enter into now. In other words, the second phase of modernity. First phase of modernity was characterized by almost unlimited access to new materials and new sources of energy, and therefore by a completely open-ended push for maximum growth, the maximization of wealth and power by those countries that were at the leading edge. And the whole familiar story of imperialism and the Western-dominated world hangs on that. It seems to me now that period is coming to an end. Most of the debates about the institutions of international society that happened during the 19th and 20th centuries, when it had to be decided what old institutions were going to be got rid of, like imperialism and racism and that sort of stuff, and what new ones were going to be brought in. So environmental stewardship being amongst those. And also which of the older institutions were going to be somehow modernized, like religion and trade, for example. So we've been through a complicated transition process in the last 2 centuries, and my argument is that that process is now more or less finished. We are entering into a period where, rather than having environmental openness, to produce and consume and pollute as much as we like, we're entering into a period which is going to be hugely more constrained by the fact that if we don't do something about it, climate change is going to undermine the foundations for civilization, not just Western civilization, but any civilization. Because if the planet goes to a kind of hothouse Earth model, then we're all going to be in fairly deep trouble. So it seems to me that modernity goes on in the sense it has infinite access to new resources and abundance of energy. There's no shortage of energy, but it has to do so within a much more constrained environment. We have, in a sense, to discover ways of making development sustainable. And if we fail at that, then we are at a kind of end of history point in one way or another, at a really big juncture in the human story. If we succeed at it, right, then we are entering into a different kind of modernity, which has different operating conditions and which will have to come to terms with the constraints of the environment in which the first round of modernity didn't. So I find the English school framing here extremely useful because it enables you to follow the institutions of international society, like, for example, dynasticism would be a good one. Dynasticism stays in being right up to the end of the 18th century and even well into the 19th and early 20th centuries, before it, as it were, disappears as one of the institutions of international society. And various forms of human inequality do the same. So that English school framing enables you to look at history, as I say, not in terms of who does what to who, which would make the story impossibly big in that time frame, but in terms of how has the social structure changed? When have been the major changes and why in the social structure that, as it were, governs global society? So that's why I find the English School useful, and this work therefore ties together pretty much everything I've been doing over the last 30 years.
Thank you, Professor. Let me go with the next set of questions. As you interestingly claim that the global international system is entering a deep and sustained transition, could you explain how the international society has transited over the years and what factors determine and will determine such changes? Second is, what would be the fate of nation state in a developing regional order? Is borders going to be stronger or weaker? The third is, what would be the deep pluralism order affect developing countries or in a developing regional order? How would such nation state be able to respond to this order?
Okay. Can you give me the third one again, please? I didn't quite catch that.
Third is like, how would the deep pluralism order affect developing countries or in a developing regional order? How would such nation state be able to respond to this order?
Okay. All right. Some of that is going to be too difficult to predict. So all one could do is set out options. The transition of global international society is, I think, as I described it in my talk, that it will move away from being Western dominated, and it will have more and more centers of wealth and power and cultural and political authority. So the core will expand as it is already, and the periphery will shrink, and the whole core periphery framing will become, I think, less and less relevant. Although I don't think we are heading anytime soon towards a world where levels of development are equally distributed across the entire planet. That may be a project of centuries, I'm not sure, but it's not going to be a product of decades. I think that's pretty clear. So that's what I see as happening, and I would make one prediction on the back of this, which is that there will be, over the coming decades, there's going to have to be a sustained renegotiation of the kinds of formal intergovernmental institutions that we have. I mean, the ones that we have were mainly set up after the Second World War, and they reflect a Western-dominated world. And although they have adapted somewhat, things like the United Nations Security Council are no longer fit for purpose. We need something like the United Nations Security Council, but the existing membership of it no longer fits the structure of wealth and power in the world. Reforming that is very difficult. These organizations are either going to die because they become irrelevant, and other organizations will be set up, or at some point they will have to be renegotiated. That strikes me as being a very long process, but it's one that you can already see underway. The Chinese and the BRICS countries have set up some of their own institutions, banks and such like. And again, I'd mentioned the G20, which becomes the forum for managing the world economy rather than the G7. That kind of trend, I think, is going to continue. On how this will affect borders, right? So here, in the English School framing, this is the institution of territoriality, right? Which has been around a long time, although its meaning has changed somewhat. It seems to me here the trend during the first round of modernity has been to harden borders and to make hard territoriality quite a major feature of global international society, with the one exception that trade and economic transactions, there's been a negotiated exception for those with world trade regimes and financial regimes and such like. And I think some form of that will remain. The new challenge is going to be, I think, migration. And this will be particularly so if the climate change issue is not addressed quickly, as seems quite likely, okay, I think we're going to be too slow meeting the climate change issue. And the natural human response throughout all history and indeed prehistory is when there's been climate change and the place where you are no longer becomes habitable, you move. That's what people do. that's almost the only response that people have. So as the climate deteriorates and places become less habitable than they have been, we have to expect more and more migration to result from this. And that's going to pose an enormous question to the institution of territoriality. Right? At the moment, the responses have been to try to strengthen borders against this. But if that's the case, then mass migration becomes a big issue. Right? What is India going to do when 100 million people in Bangladesh need to live somewhere else, for example? Or what is Europe going to do if large numbers of people living in the Middle East and Africa need to move north because the places they're living in have become too hot and too dry? The options are really pretty stark. Right? I know India has already built a fence around Bangladesh and is prepared to defend it, and the Europeans are taking a similar sort of view. So Frontex and other sorts of outfits are basically saying, yes, we don't want you to come here, and we'll turn your boats around and push you back, blah, 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 blah. We are really not very far away from the question of when do you begin to shoot people when they cross the borders that you've built a fence around. Right? In my mind, at any rate, I may be a moral defect, I'm not sure, but in my mind, there's not very much difference between letting 5,000 people drown in the Mediterranean every year or shooting them. Right? They're equally dead. And the reason is the same. Right? It's an attempt to defend territoriality. So on moral grounds and other grounds, this, it seems to me, is a very big question that international society is going to have to confront over the coming decades. Are we going to stick with defending territorial borders and kill people who try to get in when we don't want them to come in? Or are we going to say, all right, the world has changed, we need to let people in? I'm not going to put a prediction on that. There's a little bit of both going on, but that's a problem that's going to get worse before it gets better.
Thank you, Professor. We are running out of time. We have maximum 7 minutes, so maybe I'll try to put 2 sets of questions, if not at least 1 set. Like, what is your opinion about the rise of China? What do you think about the future of world order? That is 1. Second is the rise of China as a major power is one of the most important events of the 21st century. At the same time, we are witnessing a major reshuffle in the European Union. Given the fact that US and China are going to be the major contender of international politics in the coming decade, what is your opinion, the whole international society theory stands when it comes to explaining the upcoming geopolitical challenges? And third is, in your regional security complex theory, you mentioned that the security dilemma is higher between countries with closer geographical proximity. However, in South Asia, despite being closer to both India and China, the security dilemma for secondary powers seems to be more dominant from India than China. In your opinion, what theoretical perspective, Walsh or Wendt, best explain this situation?
Okay. Yes, well, I don't disagree that the rise of China is one of the major events in the 21st century. It's the leading edge. Well, it's actually not the leading edge because as I suggested, the spread of modernity has gone through quite distinct phases. So during the 19th century, there's a bunch of mainly Western states plus Japan that were in the first round of modernity. And then really nobody followed until the 1970s, when you had the Asian tigers who also as it were, found the formula that made their societies compatible with modernity and proceeded to get rich and strong. So I'm thinking of South Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore and such like. China then joined in with that, kind of got the message that the complete disaster of Mao Zedong's economic policies was absolutely unsustainable. So Deng Xiaoping is one of the great figures there. He turned China around and said, okay, this didn't work and it's not going to work. And so we need to join into the global economy and open ourselves up that way. I think that experiment in China is still ongoing and it has an uncertain outcome as yet. It seems to me Deng's policies were a great success economically, but they didn't really solve the social and political problem in China as to how, to put it bluntly, how a communist party could live governing what was in a sense a capitalist society. So the Chinese are reinventing another form of capitalism. I think India will do the same in due course, because capitalism seems to be one of the keys to reaping the wealth and power of modernity. The question is, and this is very much, I think, the big question on Xi Jinping's desk, is how much can the Chinese state reassert itself over society and over the economy, as it's been doing, pretty ruthlessly for the last 5 or 6 years. How far can that go before it actually shuts down the benefits of capitalism? The Chinese are, I think, gambling on the idea, which so far they've done rather well with, that to have capitalism, all you need is competition. You don't need private property, you don't need individualism, you don't need human rights, you don't need democracy, you don't need any of that stuff, but you do need competition. Right? If you don't have competition, then all of the innovation and the steam goes out of the economy and you don't get the benefits of wealth and power. That seems to be the great insight so far that China has generated. Their problem now is whether they can find the right kind of balance between the degree of authoritarianism that the Communist Party wants to have and the degree of, in a sense, penetrative control it wants to have over its society, which seems to look a bit back towards Maoist times, and the extent to which that's compatible with maintaining a vigorous economy. I think China has also yet to make up its mind. It talked for a while about peaceful rise, and I was very enthusiastic about that. I thought that was one of the best ideas to come out of China for a long time. Really radical, really revolutionary. Present leadership seems to have abandoned that and is busily, a bit like the Trump administration. I think Trump and Xi Jinping share some similarities here. They actually, both of them, seem to want a more hostile international environment in order to justify the kinds of changes and reforms they want to make in their domestic societies. Whether the same can be said about Modi, I'm less sure. I know less about that case. That, if true, is very worrying because it again points to a contested deep pluralism rather than a consensual one, and to the lack of respect, as it were, of other forms of government and other forms of society that we are seeing between the United States and China at the moment.
Thank you, Professor Buzan. Thank you once again for your valuable time. It was really a great learning session. We hope our audience has also benefited from it. We hope to have you in future as well, maybe in real in Kathmandu. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express our sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.